You that we can be here again today as we look into this conflict. We pray that compassion continues to grow in our hearts and understanding in our minds. May we grow to be a more well-informed people and a more loving people. We pray for peace. Amen.
Amen.
So this is our part 3 of our Israel and Palestine conflict. And I never expected to ever do any kind of contemporary topics in this class until I think, Marcia, I'm going to blame you because I remember you being the one that asked the questions that turned into people asking.
And
I never thought we would do a part 2 either. And then now we're doing a part 3. And now you guys are asking for a part 4. Yeah, so I don't know. Let me sit on that. Before I was thinking I want to be done with this. And I called my dad on the way here. I was like, I'm never doing any contemporary events again. But if we did want to have someone come in, I think that would be logical, and then I wouldn't have to share. I've had a few people at the church mad at me because of this.
For real?
Yes. So I'm getting weary of.
Why would they do that?
Why? Don't tell us who, but
because we're touching on politics, and I would imagine they just don't agree.
Life is politics. Does anybody not see
If they turn their television off and just walk.
I would think they would be happy that we're getting all sides of it.
I think they watched some of it and thought it was one-sided. Well, and there's been more than one person. But, I will look forward when we go back, though, to getting in the Bible. With that said, I think that might be a cool idea if we did have a rabbi or someone. Because I was thinking I didn't know anyone that is an Israeli. Like, I know people that are Jewish. But since, like, Danny has Palestinian roots, but that could make sense to have a rabbi come in. And Janie Allen knows a guy that comes to Bible study sometimes that's Jewish.
But we don't want just a Jewish person.
Well, he comes and gives presentations and stuff.
But I mean, I would like to have a rabbi come.
Okay. Well, maybe he also has a connection here. And then
he must have some expertise.
Yeah, and who's the Justice Knox guy?
I don't remember his name, but I can find it.
That would be great. Yeah, we'll see what we can do,
and it's Heskah, which is a conservative temple.
Oh, interesting. Okay. That's not. Okay, so our goals for today, which is the same goals we had last week, is we are going to recap that content from that first week. Just a brief little overview, and I just want to remind us of those sources that we looked at. And all of those things are linked up on the website because I have found a lot of them to be very helpful. So we're going to hear from that other side. Last week we got to hear from Danny. I have that brief little interview that I went to play from a Jewish woman that's here in the U.S. We're going to do a small little just update on the conflict with what has happened. I will say it was really disappointing for me to update these stats this week because last week was in the middle of a ceasefire. And yesterday, at least another 350 Palestinians were killed. And so just that part is sad. Then we're going to do another 2 history videos. And these are really cool. They're short, but one of them is going to be an overview of the Jewish population way back from 1500 BCE, or about 700 BCE, all the way to today and through the Middle Ages. The first week, I gave a verbal recap of this, and I had sent like a 30-minute long video, but this one is really well animated, and it's just really cool. I liked it. And then the second video is the continuation of that first one about the conflict and kind of what led to today. Granted, the videos are like 5 years old. Then we're going to spend most of our time, we're going to look at the rise of Zionism. And I'm going to verbally go over all of that. And then we are going to play another small 2-minute video that is going to give an overview of what Zionism is. And then we're going to look at Christian Zionism as well as the effect of Zionism on Christianity. And I found some really cool charts. Did anyone here grow up like believing in a rapture or ever like read the Left Behind books or anything like that? You did? I bet CAK probably has some Left Behind books in the library. So I'll wait to talk about that, but we're going to kind of end talking about that.
Possibly before we have to pay taxes.
As always, all of this stuff is up on the website that I'll resend the link to. And this morning I uploaded last week's recording with Danny. And I apologize, that took me a little longer. Rachel's car broke down Sunday, and we got back late Tuesday night, I think, or Monday night, out in Sewanee. But I got to see Sewanee for the first time. So that's our goals for today. So I want to do just a brief recap. And I started off last week by looking at this picture. So this is a picture that shows from a UN vote who wanted to recognize Palestinian statehood. And I asked the same question last week, but what do you notice that stands out as being in the minority here? Yeah, the U.S. is by itself. That's also true for much of the Anglosphere, so those English-speaking countries. And so a lot of our news sources is going to come from a different perspective than the rest of the world. And so this chart has influenced the way I've organized our slides, because we are already predisposed, just by being English speakers and by being Americans, to be more pro-Israel and more anti-Palestinian. And so a lot of my goals in here was to help us learn to humanize those Palestinians. Because I grew up thinking Palestinians are evil for some reason, and I never quite knew why. What I thought. And I just thought to give blanket support to the nation state of Israel was what good Christians did. And so that has influenced the way I've organized a lot of this presentation. Here is a chart of that in more detail. Oh, and this was the one I can't get this one to print out for some reason. But this goes in a little bit more detail. I might send out this image. It is up on the website just because it's nice, but it tells you those who recognize Israel, and then those who recognize Palestine, and those who recognize both as states, which is interesting because I didn't realize that there's a pretty large number of countries that don't recognize Israel as a state, but they do recognize Palestine. That was new information to me. Okay, we are going to give our disclaimer that we're going to cover deep material. Let's all take a deep breath.
I have a quick question. What's the difference between a state and a nation? I know Israel is a nation. My understanding was that Palestine was not a nation, but it was a state.
Danny said Palestine was an occupied territory. That's what Danny said.
So,
Danny said that Palestine was an occupied territory.
So it wasn't a nation?
No.
I think, if I'm remembering from like history class, the way we use those terms is that a nation has to do with a people group, and a state has to do with like a political structure. And so when you say a nation state, it's like a people group that have their own political structure representing themselves. But I might not be, I don't know, I'm not a geopolitician.
I will soon tell you.
Oh, great, let's get, yeah. Isn't it nice that we have encyclopedias walking around with
As long as
us?
it's not at the dinner table. That's what happens in class.
Or in youth group.
I have a question. He's on it to do.
Well, see, yeah, I'm just going to read my other disclaimer. I'm not a geopolitical expert.
Okay, I got.
What's it say?
I don't know if it'll help, but a state is an independent political entity with clear geographic boundaries. Nation is a large body of people united by common origin, history, culture, ethnicity, or language. The main difference between state and nation is state is a political and legal entity, whereas nation is a social-cultural.
That's big.
That's
That's
a
just like the Indians. Yeah, they have their nation.
True.
Nation.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And some other things that I want to say too is just with terms, so we have Hebrews, which is way back when we talk about like biblical Israel, we talk about the Hebrews. And then after a while, those people came to be known as Jews because they were from that place of Judah, or the tribe of Judah. And then now we have a modern Israeli nation state. And then there's also Palestine, which is the historic term for this region that is used in contemporary sense. You might also hear Levant or Holy Land. People use that. And a Palestinian is an ethnic description. It's not a religious description. So the ethnicity of most Palestinians is Arab, though there came to be a time when the Arabs living in Palestine began to describe themselves as their own ethnic group because they had their own dialect of Arabic, they had their own culture, their own foods, and so they began to call themselves Palestinians. And then Gaza is this place over here, which the ruling party there is Hamas. And then there is the West Bank over here that has the Palestinian National Authority. Okay, we're not going to ask any questions. And the other thing is that this is a political issue. So this is not a theology question about what people have a right to live here. And I think that's important for us to note. The conflicts that come here, they're political, and they're not rooted in thousands of years of history, as we looked at in that first presentation. It's a rather new conflict that started in the mid-1800s that happened just because of European migration, essentially. Our hope is that we become a more compassionate people. So I don't want to spend too much time because we've already looked at these things, but I'll pass this around if anyone wants to keep it. This is a chart that is going to show based on the people groups ruling in the territories of Palestine or Jews or Israel, and how that has changed. This was as of 2012. I have an updated one that's updated as of this year that I did not print it out, but we're going to have it up on the presentation. And so oftentimes when we look at charts that show us like Israel, they look like this. But in reality, it looks like this, and actually much worse.
So Israel, with my poor vision, is this green?
Is the green, correct, yes. And so this little enclave over here is what is supposed to be the West Bank. There was something called the Oslo Accords that differentiated how the occupation of West Bank is supposed to happen because a lot of Israeli settlers keep moving into the West Bank and starting settlements. We have a chart that will look at that in more detail later.
So who are those Israeli settlers?
So, yeah, that's actually a good question. So if you live in Israel right now, and when Netanyahu came back into power, the settlements kind of escalated again. There was a while it was paused, that there was no settlers. But the government will subsidize you to move into cheaper housing. And they are settlements that are in that West Bank territory. And so the government or private organizations will build a neighborhood, and because you're out in foreign territory, the military will follow you. One of the things Danny touched on last week is that this occupied territory here, it's under military rule, not state rule, so there's different rules. And that's because it's not legally Israel's land. But there are Israeli citizens that are living out there in subsidized housing. It's cheaper to live out there. And the military follows, and then they build their own roads. And one of the things that has caused is that the Palestinian neighborhoods are all separated. They can't even get to each other, and they can't cross these roads. The military is protecting them. And so that brings up good questions, because if you're happen to live in Israel and you don't have a lot of money and you want a cheap house, you're probably going to move to a settlement because it's cheap. There's other people that move there for ideological reasons, but a lot of people do it for financial. Does that make sense?
Now, is
the ideological are the very conservative zealous Jews.
Yeah, and they are.
And once they're there, they consider it their land.
Yeah.
It's not like.
Well, they bought it.
Yep. I mean, so it's a total land grab.
So the Israeli government is supporting this
Netanyahu
so that they can.
He's actually the worst person that could be in charge of Israel.
Right. So that will eventually, their hope is that land that are settlements at this point will actually become part of Israel.
That seems to.
There's got to be a reason behind it.
They feel because of course the Bible says they totally feel
so our land belongs to the dinosaurs.
and if we want a lot of it, our European ancestors that moved here, and the government said, here, have this plot of land that was someone else's, and we'll give it to you for cheap, and we'll give you some money to farm it. This was a map that goes kind of through the conflict. I know I've passed it around a few times, but we'll do it again. And I really liked this website. So this is one of those more pro-Israel sources. It's called My Virtual World Trip. And you can even tell because it says a history of Israel timeline. It doesn't even really talk about Palestine as being a thing. I like that. Also, this chart, the timeline of the land of Israel, it's from travelingisrael.com. This guy also has a YouTube channel, and he is very, he hates Palestinians. And I thought about playing a video of his to be our pro-Israel one, but it was a little too much that I didn't feel comfortable sharing it. But this is that chart, but again, this is going to be one of those more very biased and pro-Israel. I also, if you want to see an article, the Kids Britannica Encyclopedia has a nice article on Palestine that will go through the history of it, and they're just a good source. So, and then this was our kind of summary point for the history. So between 66 and 135, many Jews moved out of Palestine in what we call the diaspora. And so that was Rome was ruling in this area. There was a great persecution that happened. Remember, 70 CE is when the destruction of the temple happened, and all of Jerusalem was kind of flattened. And so many people moved throughout the world into different regions, and that kind of remained in that place until 634, when the Islamic Empire conquered Palestine. There was a bunch of different dynasties during that time, but essentially it stayed the same until 1099 when we get to the Crusades. And it kept kind of going back and forth between Christian and Islamic rule until the 1500s when the Ottoman Empire took over this area. And then that remained until 1917 at the end of World War I. It came under British rule, and everything got really messed up at that point. While this is happening, there is a movement, largely because of Christian Europeans persecuting Jews in Europe, that many Jews were moving back to Palestine, to the Holy Land. And that movement of moving back and trying to find their own state, we call that Zionism. At first, the Zionist movement wasn't necessarily about moving back to Israel. It was just, or to Palestine. It was just finding a state somewhere. Uganda was one of the big offerings that they almost moved to. And then, that led to the modern conflict. When you look at history this way, it makes you go, oh, this isn't a thousands-year-old conflict. It's actually quite new, from the mid-1800s. And this was our charts that we looked at with the population. I think this is really helpful. So this is about the 1880s. So most of the population is Muslim. There's also a pretty sizable amount of Christians and a very small minority of Jews. So these charts are going to shift pretty quickly. And then this is how you see the Jewish population jumps from 1922 to 1931. Any guesses on why people would be moving around then?
First World War.
Yeah, the Second World War happening. The persecution's kicking up. They needed somewhere to go. And the international community was very supportive at this time. So this is 1931. The Jewish population has skyrocketed, but there's still a pretty sizable amount, or large majority is Muslims and Christians. And it very quickly changes. This is in like less than 15 years, or a little over 15 years.
Do you know what would be helpful if they'd done percentages?
I might have another chart that does that actually. Did I miss a? I did. Okay, this was a video that I sent out. It was about Jerusalem. It's like 20, 30 minutes long. I still recommend it from useful charts. Here we go. And then this was the video that we played that first time. So it begins and ends with this interview of a Palestinian man, and he talks about his village being wiped out. So this was kind of before Israel was a state. There was a bunch of different Zionist militia groups. Some were more tame than others, and some were pretty awful. And he lived in one of the villages that got wiped out and killed. And he tells that story. It also goes through some of the history. Then we played this video, and I highly recommend this one. It's Crash Course. It is a PBS-sponsored free education course online. John Green, who is an author, is the narrator for this video, and it's a very well-balanced presentation of kind of presenting both sides as both being a hurt people and a displaced people, but does talk about kind of the history of the conflict. Then there was another history video. Okay, that was what we had looked at in that first week. Now, last week we got to hear from Danny Hard. That video is now up online if you missed it. I want to play this video, which I could not get this one linked. If you'll excuse me just a second while I pull this up.
And the explosion of anti-Semitism.
So this is a very brief little news article within a Jewish woman that I thought was
as
nice.
Those who lived through the Holocaust are particularly scared, and now remembering with even more poignance the Night of Broken Glass, which happened exactly 85 years ago. NBC's Emma Barnett reports.
Rhody Glass was 5 years old in September of 1942 when the Dutch police removed her family from their home.
They shoved us down the stairs, and there was an army truck out front of our house, and it was one of the first raids.
Her family was put on a train to Westerbork transit camp. Days later, they were called up to be counted and deported to a death camp. One of the Nazis recognized Rhody's mother because they lived on the same street in Amsterdam.
When we got to his part of the table, he took our name off the list. Had he not done so, I would not be sitting here.
Rhody survived the unimaginable as a kid. Now, more than 80 years later, the world is witnessing the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust.
Israel has to defend itself. It's the only good thing that came out of the Holocaust.
She also feels the pain and suffering caused by this new war in the Middle East.
What has been your reaction to seeing innocent Palestinians and children being caught in the crossfire of this war?
Terrible. When I see children, I go back, I see me. These children are innocent. These people are caught in a no-win situation. Hamas has them in their power, and they have no way out. It's a hopeless situation. When I see these children, it kills me.
As the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center marks the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht, Holocaust survivors say they are heartbroken by the rise of anti-Semitism and by the loss of innocent civilian lives in the Israel-Hamas war.
During Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, Nazis vandalized Jewish homes, burned down synagogues, and killed close to 100 Jews.
Kristallnacht is a very important date in Holocaust history because it was a mass pogrom against the Jewish people. And as we are seeing violence against civilians, this is a moment that is very reminiscent for many of our survivors and the stories that we tell here.
The museum released a letter signed by 10 Holocaust survivors. It references the post-Holocaust saying, "Never again," and warns history can repeat itself. The letter reads, "The world is failing at its duties. People are retreating to their corners, casting blame on those who look, sound, or worship differently."
I think that Jews will only have safety and security when Palestinians also have a degree of dignity and equality. But by the same token, Palestinians will never have dignity and equality unless their Jewish neighbors also have safety and security. It's not either or, it's both and.
Concerns about safety and security in Jewish communities has extended beyond Israel's borders, with a global spike in anti-Semitism since October 7th, evoking dark memories of Kristallnacht.
Today we're seeing a wave of acts of vandalism targeting synagogues, and other Jewish institutions, as well as businesses that simply are owned by Jewish people. The parallels are eerie and deeply worrisome.
And for someone who has experienced so much pain, Rodi believes the solution relies on something completely different.
As a survivor and victim of the Holocaust, I could very easily hate. But I don't know how that emotion feels. I don't know how to hate. Why not lead with love?
I listened to lots of interviews, and this one was one of my favorites. And I really appreciated the crash course video that we watched because it talked about people having narratives. And I might have a different narrative.
How do you find the crash course video?
I will include a link to it when I send out the summary today.
Is it YouTube?
It is on YouTube. And Crash Course is a educational series. They go through lots of different topics from philosophy to history to English to physics. This, I think, was in the history course, and they have groups of different history courses you can go through.
On PBS.
Well, it's its own. They are a PBS-sponsored organization. And even like when I was in high school, we watched Crash Course videos for my history class sometimes. It is geared, though, for high school students, so it is a little silly sometimes. But one thing that he talks about is learning to sit with the validity of someone else's narrative. And I find that really valuable because, we all have our own narratives, and we usually listen to one narrative. But when I remember, like, for those other people that lived through the Holocaust and listen to their narrative, it makes you a lot more compassionate. When I listen to a Palestinian that's been kicked out of their own home or their own home has been destroyed, it also makes me a lot more compassionate. And those don't have to conflict. And so, as Danny shared, let's remember to keep hearing from all people and from all sides. Any questions or comments before we move away from that? Okay. I want to give a brief update of how the conflict has gone on. So this is the data that I had gotten for last week. So last week was the 7th day of a truce that lasted 10 days. And I want to just remember how it all started. So on October 7th, there was more than 1,200 people killed in Israel. And almost 7,000 people were injured. That's a lot of people in that surprise attack. And this is what we have been calling the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. It was an atrocious event. It was an awful event. And we all remember that. But it was a long time ago, so it's important to remember. Since then, and this was from last week, there was over 15,000 Palestinians killed. And 4 out of 10 are children. So this is the new information. That truce ended on December 1st. So the fight is still going on. Israel's was kind of in northern Gaza. They're pushing further and further south. Some of the news articles I have seen are saying that more than 60% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed. I think destroyed is a bit of an exaggeration. Damaged would be better, though many homes have been destroyed. And now it's over 17,000 Palestinians have been killed. The data of confirmed deaths from yesterday was 350. That's a lot of people to die in one day, especially in a very small 10-mile strip of land. And nearly 2 million people have been displaced since this conflict began. And that's just in Gaza. That's not including where this has sparked conflicts in other places. I wanted to show this. So I have a friend that he just got back again from Jordan and from Israel. And he had shared this on Facebook. I talked with him last night, asked him if I could share it. So this is his friend's house, was right there. And they're a Christian group. And I just wanted to show this photo because it's a person that's only once displaced from me that we went to school with at Johnson. And there's his family's home that's destroyed, and obviously they've had to flee that area. But this is a conflict that affects real people. It's something to remember in the holidays. My friend Matt, this is his organization he helped found. It's called the Christian Holy Land Foundation. If anyone's ever interested in looking about that, they go on mission trips and stuff into into Israel and into Palestine. That is the updated information from there. This is from, where did I get this? I apologize. I don't remember the news source that I got this from, and I didn't put it on here. But this has the updated information. You can just see how the death toll just goes up and up and up. It's sad. And now we're at over 17,000 people. I wanted to show this chart as well, and we did look at this. So this data hasn't been updated since November 6th, but this is the annual fatalities in the conflict. The purple is for Israel, the orange is for Palestinians. And then I have one more chart. So this is the conflicts around the world that children have died in. And so this has now become the deadliest conflict for children. And that includes with the Ukrainian war. So one thing to keep in mind, this isn't the deadliest conflict in the world right now, but it is the worst in this region. And that has been in a long time, and it is affecting a lot of children. And so last week we did that prayer litany. I don't want to do that whole prayer again, but I am going to pass that sheet around for those that were not here, and if you want to take it home. This was used in the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem, and it was written by a Palestinian American priest, Episcopal priest in Texas. And that's the litany prayer that we did last week. If you want to find it, you can get it from thankfulpriest.com. And the way that I found this litany is that the Episcopal Church has an Office of Government Relations, and on their website they have a lot of information that you can get relating to this conflict. It is there for kind of reputable news sources, other prayer sources, things that you can donate to if you want to donate to humanitarian aid, and this is that link. I can include that when I send it out as well. Oh, yeah. I found another website this week. This was just a really great source that I found, and I got a lot of their images. If you go on their website, they're interactive when you go on there, which is kind of cool. I'm not going to try to pronounce whatever that is, but I wanted to include the URL in the presentation. And this is some information that they have regarding the conflict. So they say the settlements are illegal under international law, but over the years, hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers have moved to colonies built on stolen Palestinian land. The space for Palestinians is shrinking as settler-only roads and infrastructure slice up the occupied West Bank, forcing Palestinian cities and towns into, I'm not even sure how to say this word. Does anyone know how this is pronounced? This was a new term to me. Yeah, which they say are isolated enclaves for Black South Africans that the country's former apartheid regime created. I had another. It might be next. I wanted to show this though. These are the. This is the West Bank in the occupied territory. So I don't know if you can see this. On this, it shows those under Palestinian control. And so if you remember, Danny was talking about where he's from, the Ramallah is right here, which I didn't know, but he said it's kind of the administrative district. That is, and there's a couple of other ones. Not that much. That's it. These are the places that are under joint Israeli-Palestinian control. And then the blue, these are those occupied territories under Israeli control. And that's the Israeli military that's on that area. Did I lose a slide? I lost a slide. We might have a random slide pop up. I have another quote from that article. This is another chart that is showing where the settlements are. And so I don't know if you can see all of these red dots, but those are the settlements that continue to be established that are illegal, according to the UN. So not all of them are. There was the Oslo Accords. That was an agreement that the U.S. helped negotiate for how they would kind of divide up the West Bank in light of all of these settlements that had happened. Wow, I lost that slide too. Okay, I'm not sure what happened to my. Okay, all right. This is just a picture of the North Bank. Of the Gaza Strip, and it shows kind of there's like a siege essentially around the Gaza Strip, and so all export and import is kind of cut off. It's kind of a pretty devastating situation. I don't want to spend too much time looking at it. And then this is a cool chart, and it's all in this article that goes through some of the different conflicts and how long they have lasted. And it just tells you, currently there is 2.3 million people that live in the Gaza Strip. The unemployment rate is almost 50%. So it's a pretty hard place to be alive, and that was before the conflict happened. I was going to play these other two videos. I'm going to wait to play them right now because I want to get to this other part of the presentation, but I will include them. They are they were just really cool. It goes through with a map. It just shows you. It was just really well illustrated. It makes it really clear. But there's two parts. That one that goes over the history of the Jewish population, and then the other one that goes kind of more recently to the conflict. Highly recommend watching these. And if we have time, I'll come back and we'll play them. So, has anyone ever heard the term Zionism before? Okay. Do you know who this guy is? So this is Theodor Herzl. He was an Australian journalist. He is the father of Zionism. Zionism as a movement existed before Theodor, but he was the one that kind of established it as the movement. He popularized it a lot in his writings. And again, we call him the father of Zionism. So it was a movement that was primarily formed around Jews having a homeland in Palestine. That was Theodor's version of it. But even Theodor, at first in his writings, was like, we just need somewhere to live because of all of the persecution that we are experiencing. And so there was a long history of Zionism kind of as a fringe movement. So in the 15th and the 16th centuries, there was these Jewish Messiah movements, and a lot of them would kind of form around a Zionist movement of kind of returning to a homeland. A lot of this has to do with Austria-Hungary, and they were kind of an empire with lots of different people groups that were mixed in, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism that was going on there. And this, as a movement, was actually kept alive by Christian millennialists, and we'll go in a little bit more detail about that. But they were a minority movement that really spread during the Reformation. So when the Protestant Reformation happened, and they were, it's a kind of a belief about the end times that a literal 1,000 year, hence millennium, will be established by Jesus. And when they look at all these different Bible verses, kind of the narrative goes is that there has to be a nation state of Israel and a temple that is rebuilt. And so for a lot of Christians, their support of Israel is directly tied to their kind of the foundations of their religion and God's kind of plan for the entire world. That's how I grew up thinking. So in the 1800s, Theodor was the one that popularized this idea. And it was largely due to a response from that anti-Semitic kind of culture that was around him. And so he was like, we need a place that we can live and not be persecuted. Because if you were Jewish, you didn't have the same rights as those around you. And so it began to spread. And once we get into the 1900s, it begins to really slowly begin to rise in popularity, and then it starts to take off after World War I. I apologize that this picture is blurry. This is a really, really old picture of some Jewish European settlers that moved into Palestine. And so the Zionists began to petition the Ottomans that there could be an independent Palestine. And so that was kind of the first request, was just that Palestine would be independent and they could move in there as free citizens. The Ottomans said, no, we're not just going to give up our territory and give it to you. And so then they began to petition Great Britain. And so the Great Britain offered them 6,000 square miles in Uganda. And they said, here we go, you can have this land, nobody wants it. But as the Zionist movement was gaining in popularity, they declined and they said, no, we're going to hold out and we're going to wait and return to the Holy Land. And so they kept waiting for that. There was 6 or 7 other big proposals. One of them was kind of like a Russian oblast that could be a state for them. There was another like a city in the U.S. and I can't remember where it was, but there was all these other different proposals and ideas that people were throwing around. But the one that got the most movement was Palestine. So after a failed Russian Revolution, many Russian Jews moved out, again because of persecution. And so by 1914, there was 100,000 Jews that were living in Palestine in these 43 different settlements. And this was new to me, there was a French philanthropist named Baron Edmond Rothschild, and he was the one that funded a lot of these settlements. I heard y'all say his name. Do you know who he is?
Rothschild is very famous.
Oh, why am I missing out?
Banking, Jewish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Rothschilds.
I'm showing my ignorance of this era. Okay. So after World War I is when that Balfour Declaration was made. We talked about that in that first presentation. And so Great Britain ended up just giving up, essentially, because they were supporting this immigration into the area. And what ended up happening when large swaths of immigration happened is conflict because of displacement. And so eventually Great Britain kind of just gave up this land and gave it over to the international community. And that's all the history that we know.
So the Jews continued to come at the Palestinians to look to this place. Were those the Muslims?
So most of the Palestinians were Muslim. So before this, it was about 80% Muslim, about 20% Christian. And the way it kind of worked is that there would be landowners that didn't always live there. And so a lot of so the early Zionist movement was very socialist or communist. A lot of them came from Russia and other kind of Eastern European countries. And so they would form all these kind of communities together where they would sell everything that they have and buy the land and move there to farm. And so they would buy it from the landowners, but most of the people, or the landowners, but most of the people that lived there were the Palestinian farmers. And they would then kick them out of that land that they had purchased. And that was kind of how the settlements started.
Is that what a kibbutz is?
What?
Yes. Okay.
What was the word?
Kibbutz.
Okay.
The settlement. But I think a lot of the Zionists didn't think that Palestine was occupied. I mean, there were people there. They felt like it was land they could take.
Yeah.
It was problematic from the very beginning. I mean, my mother's Jewish, so I consider myself Jewish. I'm pro-Israel, but I think what Israel's doing is unsustainable and it's horrible. And but the problem is you can't criticize. It's two different things, Zionism and Jews, and you can't criticize without being called anti-Semitic. But I mean, on the other hand, it's an excuse now for anti-Semitism, which has always been there. It's an excuse now for that to become more out there. So it's a.
That's the plan, to hide and use the Palestinians as the human shields. So they started it.
Hamas.
Yeah,
I mean, Hamas is horrible.
Creating the situation by using the human shields.
But you could say Israel started it because they put the settlements in the Palestinian area. So, who's to blame?
Nobody's innocent. But unfortunately, this Netanyahu got voted back in, and now has this very conservative Jews faction is now in the government. They were not considered legitimate up until now, but he needs them to keep him in the government. There was a film festival in New York, and there was a film about these Christian millennials who are waiting for the apocalypse.
Yeah.
They're waiting, and they don't care what happens. I mean, to them, this is like a good thing. They're waiting for to just crash and burn. I couldn't even watch it; it was so scary. But and they have some power. And I'm sorry.
That was how I grew up. Was what we had. This is not a joke. We had bags and like containers of food ready and we were waiting for Israel to take over, because that means Jesus is coming back. That was every single Sunday growing up, we had more than hour-long sermons, and that was a lot of the content that it would be about. So it gets really entranced, and it's hard to understand that if you didn't grow up in it. I'm glad that you shared, though, about when we come to here, with the rise of Zionism, when it started, it just meant we are persecuted people with no rights in the countries we live, and we want a homeland where we can be free to worship, which sounds a lot like us as Americans when we came here.
Yeah. You're right. Alexander, I have a question. It may not be appropriate, but why did this latest conflict start October 7th? My understanding is that Israel and Saudi Arabia were in the process of some sort of agreement. Do you know anything about the specifics of what that agreement was?
I know a vague amount. So if you remember, we talked about like when Israel became a state, and then there was the Arab League that declared war. And so the Arab community was kind of all together saying we don't like Israel. And those things have began to shift lately. And so one of those things was Saudi Arabia was going to have a new pact with Israel, has to do with oil rights and some other things. And so, and there was another. It might have been Egypt. I can't remember because it's been a few months. And again, I'm not a geopolitical. I'm just a Bible nerd. But Iran didn't like that, and so I remember early on, a lot of the evidence was that Iran had backed a lot of different groups. However, one thing to keep in mind too is that Netanyahu didn't have a functioning government, and the military withdrew and wasn't there right before the conflict happened, and right after the war, his power was solidified and made valid. So I don't think that sounds too much like a conspiracy theory.
I've also heard some of this tied to Putin. So
yeah, because it was Putin's birthday.
It was.
Oh, really?
I didn't know that.
I did not know that. I didn't realize he had birthdays.
And it was more than 8 hours. It could have been 10 or 12 hours before the army came in to do anything. Yeah. They just let them do whatever. Now that to me is very suspicious too. Why would the army sit back and say, "Well, I'm not going to do anything"?
So in essence, what we're saying is the spark that started this latest conflict was the pact that was becoming between Saudi Arabia and Israel, with Iran not happy about that.
I think that's been one of the stated reasons, but this is an ongoing conflict too.
Yes. No, I know that. That's why I was saying there had to have been a spark.
Yeah.
It started just.
It's like trying to deal with Jello, but
Yeah.
that won't gel.
Yeah.
You know, like you think you got it. You know, and then it oozes into something else. I don't know.
These are great questions. I'm going to play this brief little video on Zionism. It's not that long, but it does a good job, and it's going to talk about some of the Russian socialist parts that we tend to forget about.
The A to Z of isms, Zionism. For its supporters, Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. For its opponents, it is a means to establish a settler colonial state in the developing world. Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist and playwright, founded the modern Zionist movement in 1897. Yet many Orthodox Jews strongly oppose the rise of Zionism. They believe that the Jews would only return to Zion, the land promised by God to the Jews in the Hebrew Bible, with the eventual coming of the Messiah. Jews should therefore not force God's hand. There were many types of Zionists: Marxist, religious, nationalist, liberal, social democrat, the forerunners of today's political parties in Israel. Both Zionism and Arab nationalism arose during the same period of history, with claims over the same piece of land, a geographical area known for centuries to Jews as the land of Israel. This is the ideological basis of the seemingly intractable Israel-Palestinian conflict. While there's been a Jewish presence in the Holy Land since biblical times, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Jews were few in number compared to Christian and Muslim Arabs. Unlike other national liberation movements whose supporters were actually living on the territory that they wished to free, Zionist Jews had first to emigrate from the far-flung diaspora, build an infrastructure, and only then initiate a liberation struggle. Zionism, therefore, does not fit into conventional theory. So, is Zionism wrong or just different? In the aftermath of the French Revolution, many 19th century Jews began to regard themselves as a people with a history, literature, culture, and language, and not just followers of an ancient religion, Judaism. Many were highly influenced by progressive national movements in Europe, such as the Risorgimento of Mazzini Garibaldi for a united Italy, and Irish Republican efforts to throw off the yoke of British domination. The example of Russian revolutionary Lenin influenced the socialist Zionist leader and first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. Lenin demonstrated what could be achieved with a handful of supporters. Many East European Jews wanted to escape the heavy hand of Russian anti-Semitism. So the early Zionists were often revolutionary socialists who not only wished to build a new country, but also to construct a new society, unlike the ones they had just left. One of the building blocks of this new society was the kibbutz, a self-sufficient, self-governing collective. There were many possible territorial solutions where a Jewish state could be built. They ranged from the Portuguese colony of Angola to the Jewish autonomous region in the USSR, Azerbaijan, on the border of China. Herzl even approached the British with the idea that Uganda might be a night shelter on the road to the land of Israel. Some supporters believe that Zionism completed its task when the State of Israel was established in 1948. Others believe that the Zionist project cannot be considered complete until Israel is at peace, secure within its boundaries and within the wider region, and creates a fairer society for all its inhabitants.
I thought that was a nice, quick video giving it. And I like how it talks. Oh, don't look at this yet. I like how it talks about. Let me lose my train of thought. How it talks about there's kind of two ideas of Zionism. One was just finding a homeland, which was needed. There needed to be a safe place for people experiencing persecution that had been displaced. And so for some, that was the goal. And then for others, it means something more than that. We're going to end with kind of a disclaimer about terms, but I'll wait to get to that point. So I want to talk about Christian Zionism, or at least the effect Zionism had on Christianity and how those things became intertwined. So this is that Left Behind series, which do you know what it is? Like,
yeah, I've heard about it.
Oh my gosh!
I never read it.
I read the first one.
I'm sorry. Okay, if you want to laugh, go get a bottle of wine and watch the first movie and try to laugh while watching it. And then keep in mind that is really what people believe will happen. So
What is the thing?
So it is about Kirk Cameron is like a reporter, and then the rapture happens. So like everyone goes away, and so there's like all these like types. It's like a sermon in a movie. Mm-hmm. And so like one guy is a pastor, but he wasn't a real Christian. Mm-hmm. And so he gets left behind. Kirk Cameron just really hated God for some reason. So he was like the stereotypical atheist that hates God. And then they form this group of Christians that realize, oh, God was real. But the whole world is following behind this leader that is the Antichrist. And it's in the European Union, because there's like that one world order and stuff, and that is what that guy's establishing, and like he can't die. Like they hit him with missiles because the president became Christian, and like he just walks out of the fire. That's how it ends. There's lots of books and other things. It's silly, but it is rooted in a viewpoint that we call dispensational premillennialism. And I have a couple of charts that are awesome, and I'll hand them out as I come to them. And so I did want to say this, though. So a lot of people, when they read like the kind of apocalyptic literature or those kind of end times parts in the scripture, there's 4 main points of views that they're going to take. And we call them preterist, historicist, allegorical, and a futurist. So a preterist is those that might read the book of Revelation, and they'll say, hey, these are things that happened in the past. Like in the past from when Revelation was written. So this destruction of the temple that it's talking about isn't some future temple that's not been built yet. It was the temple that was destroyed way back when. And like when you get to, well, there's no antichrist in the Bible. There's lots of different antichrists, but this beast figure in the mark of the beast, that 666 number, they'll correlate it to being Nero, whose name's added up, and that was what the first Christians all thought too. So that's the preterist, that these things are talking about past events. There's also the historicist. This is not really a popular view anymore. This really was a lot of the reformers began to adopt this view, and that was that Revelation is kind of planting out the large movements of history, and for them the Antichrist was the Pope, because and that beast is the Roman Catholic Church. But that's not really a thing as much anymore. The other one is allegorical. And so that is the idea that maybe Revelation is talking about this grand conflict of good versus evil. And there's all this symbolic imagery that we won't really understand because it's too complicated. But it is talking about this big fight of good versus evil. And it doesn't have any rootedness in actual events at all. And then the other is futurist. That is a newer point of view. Essentially, and that's the idea that Revelation and all these things it's talking about are all future from us. And people at that point of view try to decipher different things. So if you're in like the Left Behind books, there's this description of a plague of scorpions that are going to rise out of the desert. And so for Left Behind, that's helicopters that come from the Middle East in a war. And that's what I thought growing up. And so that turns into like how people interpret when they read scripture. They usually fall into 4 different views. And so we talk about it with the word millennial. And so that means 1,000 years, because there's this part in Revelation where it says Jesus will reign for 1,000 years. The all-millennial, which is kind of the standard Christian view, is that 1,000 doesn't mean a literal 1,000 years. It's just talking about how Jesus is reigning right now. This is the time that Jesus is king. He is enthroned after the ascension. That's the kind of standard Christian view. There's also one we call pre-millennial, and those are people that think there's going to be some type of rapture or something, or that Christ will return before this literal 1,000 years. And then there's going to be an Armageddon and this big battle that's going to happen. And then there's post-millennial. That's not really popular anymore. It was before the World Wars. But that is the idea that the world slowly gets better until it turns into the kingdom of God kind of idea. And I have charts that are going to look at these. I don't want to talk about the other stuff, but there was a Bible called the Schofield Bible, and this guy named John Darby wrote notes in it, and he was the one that really popularized the idea of like a rapture and all this stuff. And it was the Bible that went to print for the U.S., which is why this is such like an American evangelical thing to have all these different ideas. That also was connected with the Great Awakening. One way that preachers motivate people is by scaring them. And so when you can tell people the world is about to end and then use a Bible verse that kind of supports that idea, it made people really scared. And so they would convert and kind of have these ideas. These are some Bible verses that talk about rapture theology. Does anyone care about looking at them? Okay, all right, great. All right, I'm seeing from the responses that here is some charts that are really cool. I thought that these were really silly. So there is 2 types of premillennials. The dispensationalists, here is I Heart Left Behind, and they have the flag of Israel. That is that one I grew up with. That's that kind of the weird ones. There's also what we call historic premillennialist. That was a kind of minority Christian view, and that one we talked about in the 1600s that some Christians held on to. And then there's that all-millennialist. They say it's simple. Christ is returning, no raptures, roadmaps, or all that scary stuff. And then post-millennial, the world will only get better through the unstoppable gospel. If you want to get more in detail about how people would make timelines and stuff, there's another chart going around that has all of that. And if you want to get in even further detail, I have another one because you might care about this stuff. Okay, but it doesn't look like you do. So here's our last thoughts about all of this. We can't do much about Israel and Palestine in this conflict here in East Tennessee. That is the reality of that situation. With that said, being informed is important. And so my encouragement to everyone is to still study. I like Danny said, go and find other people's point of view. So perhaps in a while, we will bring someone in, a rabbi, to come and share from that other point of view. Or we might not. I don't know. We'll see. I'll see other people's feedback. My hope, though, from doing all of this in these series of presentations is that we all become more compassionate. And I wanted to say this. You don't have to be pro or anti-Zionist. And being pro-Zionist doesn't mean you're anti-Palestine. And being anti-Zionist doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. These are different categories, and people use some of these terms differently as well. But you don't have to figure it out. The other thing is, let's keep in mind, this is not the deadliest conflict going on in the world right now.
What is?
Right now, there are some things that are going on in Africa, and there is the ongoing Ukrainian-Russian war, but even that's not the deadliest conflict either. We tend to give more weight to those things we feel closer to. So for Ukraine and Russia, because they're white Europeans, that kind of sits heavier with us. And for the Israel-Palestine, because of our kind of Christian connections, it feels larger. There are other things going on in the world too. That doesn't mean that this is not significant. We shouldn't care about it. We should. But let's remember those other things that happen and care about them. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this are we done for December?
Yes. So we're not going to do this. We will come back sometime in January. That I need to look at a calendar and see. I don't think it makes sense for us to do one chapter right before the holidays and break for like a month. And so I'm going to try to not make anyone else mad at the church. And when we come back, we will go through Exodus. Say what?
So you have read up to chapter 25 in Exodus?
When we come back in January, we will do chapters 25 through 27. It's the part about the donation, so it's when the tabernacle gets built, which is really exciting. So I look forward to when we get there. But that will be sometime in January.
So this is our last class for December.
Correct, yes.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought there would be more rapture questions and stuff. If anyone wants to stay, I can play these two videos. Or I can just send them out. They are each just about 10 minutes. This first one's 8 minutes. This other one's 9 minutes.
I'll stay.
You want to stay? Okay. I'm going to help Bart get something, so I'm going to step out, and then I'll be back in a minute.
A century ago, a conflict arose which would quickly become one of the most complex and controversial in the world. A conflict between two very different people for the same territory. To understand its origins, let's retrace the history of the Jewish people on a map. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be explained in a following video. The story begins in 750 BC, when the Near East was divided into many small kingdoms and city-states. They were wedged between the Assyrian Empire to the north and Egypt in the south. Among them was the kingdom of Israel, whose people worshipped several gods, including Yahweh. In 722 BC, the capital Samaria fell to the Assyrian Empire. Part of the population then fled to the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem, but they would be followed by the Assyrian army as they continue their expansion towards the south. The region then remains under their control for a century until the fall of Nineveh to the Babylonians. Egypt and Babylon would then compete for territories of the old empire, but the Babylonians quickly take over and project their power in the region. Jerusalem resists this new rule and rebels. The Babylonian army then returns to besiege and destroy the city. Much of the population is then moved to the capital. In 539 BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire takes over Babylon. The new king authorizes a free passage for Judeans, prompting many to return to Jerusalem. They would then rebuild the city and organize the foundations of Jewish culture by building the Temple of Solomon and writing the Torah. In 334 BC, the ambitious young Macedonian king Alexander the Great set out with his army to conquer the known world. In just over 10 years, he rakes up a huge territory and builds many cities. But exhausted by conquest, he died at age 32 in Babylon without an heir of governing age. The empire was then divided by his generals into various Hellenic kingdoms. Judea came under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty. A Jewish community settles in the new city of Alexandria, and the Torah is translated into Greek. Following a war against the Seleucid dynasty, Hellenic and Jewish culture developed friction to the point that one of the altars of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was dedicated to the worship of Zeus. The traditionalist anti-Hellenic Jewish militia is organized and takes control of Jerusalem in 164 BC. The temple is restored and the kingdom of Judea becomes independent. A century later, the region was conquered by the Roman army. The Judeans would organize two major revolts against the new regime, which were violently crushed. The first revolt in 66 provoked the siege of Jerusalem, followed by the destruction of its temple. The only wall of the enclosure that survived would become known as the Wailing Wall. During the second revolt, the city was razed and a great part of the population slaughtered. This time, the Jews were forbidden a safe passage to Judea. Many migrate to Galilee and across the empire. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, Christianity was the dominant religion and Jerusalem a place of pilgrimage. The largely well-to-do Jewish community in the Mediterranean basin began to be persecuted, especially in the Visigoth and Byzantine empires. In the 7th century, following the birth of Islam, begins an Arab conquest. In some cases, Jews support the conquest in the hope of better conditions. They are tolerated by the Arabs and only polytheistic peoples are forcibly converted. In Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock is built, making the city holy to the three monotheistic religions. The Arabs arrive at the Iberian Peninsula, which they call Al-Andalus. Here, 5% of the population is Jewish, ushering in a golden age of culture. Meanwhile, in Europe, Jews are not only tolerated as people who witnessed times before Christ, but also as the sole traders between Catholics and Muslims. This allows Jews to gradually establish themselves in all of Western Europe. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, a Central Asian people, began their expansion and reached Jerusalem. They persecute Christians and forbid pilgrimages to the city. In response, Christians in Europe organized crusades, military and religious expeditions to the Holy City. Along the way, they massacred Jewish communities who they now consider a deicide people who killed Jesus Christ. In 1347, Genoese merchant boats from Kaffa helped spread the Black Death. In 5 years, the disease wreaks havoc in Europe, killing almost half its population. A rumor spreads accusing Jews of poisoning whales, resulting in their persecution mainly along the Rhine and Rhone region and their eventual expulsion. In Spain, the Reconquista ends. The Catholic kings serve an ultimatum to the Jews to either convert or leave. The majority who choose to leave settle along the Mediterranean coast, mainly in the Ottoman Empire, where they are welcomed. The Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth becomes a haven for Jews from Western Europe due to favorable migration policies. In the 17th century, the region hosts more than 300,000, or about half of the Jews in the world. But everything changed in 1648 with the revolt of the Cossacks' Ukrainian peasants against the nobility and the Jews. They accused the Jews of having a privileged relationship with those in power. More than 100,000 Jewish people are killed or flee the region. This episode would weaken the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, besieged on all sides by neighboring powers. In 150 years, the regime falls and its territory is carved up. The Jewish community is divided, and 900,000 of them find themselves in the Russian Empire, where they are not welcome. They quickly become the targets of attacks called pogroms, a Russian term meaning devastation. Given the lack of response from authorities, these attacks become more frequent and deadly. The Jews then emigrate to the United States and Western Europe, which in the meantime has improved their living conditions. It is in this context that the first Zionist Congress is held in Basel in 1897, contemplating the founding of a new homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. But the Ottoman Empire is fiercely opposed to the project. A few years later, the First World War breaks out. The Ottoman Empire fought alongside Germany. When the Allies were in trouble and desperately sought further support, the then British Minister of Foreign Affairs, Arthur Balfour, wrote an open letter promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine in return for Jewish support. In parallel, they support the Arab rebellion against the Ottoman Empire by promising them independence in the liberated territories. At the end of the war, the map of the Middle East was redrawn and divided up between the European powers. Palestine comes under the British mandate, marking the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So I thought that video was awesome.
I've been looking for that for years.
I know, yeah. I go through an amazing amount of things that are good.
So where is that?
It's their YouTube channel.
That YouTube.
I'm going to send it. Yes. I cannot remember the name of the channel, but he does all these videos with maps. I want to say it was. I don't want to say the wrong name, but.
So helpful.
Yeah, I thought that one was pretty great. And when you watch that, he goes,
narrator a little hard to understand.
No wonder there needed to be a homeland for these people because it's just going back and forth conflict. So.
You know, even in the Jews in our.
Oh, this other video has been taken down.
I know.
Very good.
Yeah.
I love it. Just British business was there. The British speaker.
100 years ago began a regional conflict that would quickly become.
It's called Geohistory, is the channel. Also, the information they had for like pre-Persian Israel was really accurate to like modern scholarship, so that made me really happy.
And one of the world's most complex and controversial. A conflict between two very different people for the same territory. To better understand its reasons and underlying issues, let's retrace the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a map.
Sorry.
We are in 1917 during World War I. The Central Powers were opposed to the so-called Triple Entente and its allies. Both sides suffer heavy losses and desperately seek additional support. The then British Foreign Affairs Minister, Arthur Balfour, wrote an open letter promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine in return for support from the growing Zionist movement. Meanwhile, the British tried to weaken the Ottoman Empire by supporting the Arab rebellion and promising them independence in liberated territories. At the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was defeated and its land carved up by European powers. The British give more independence to Iraq and Transjordan. It is in what remains of Palestine that Britain wants to create a Jewish homeland where the Jewish community was a small minority. But immigration grows rapidly due to the tense situation in Europe, especially in Germany, where the anti-Semitic Nazi Party came into power. In September 1939, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France respond by declaring war, sparking the beginning of World War II. In 5 years, the conflict claims more than 60 million lives, including almost 6 million Jews targeted by the Holocaust. Following the war, Jewish immigration to Palestine grows, increasing tensions with Arabs. Overwhelmed by the situation, the British begin their withdrawal from the area. The UN takes over and proposes to divide the region into 2 states, with Jerusalem being given a special status of an international zone. The proposal was accepted by Zionists but rejected by Palestinian Arabs, followed by a civil war between the 2 communities. The Arab League puts together a liberation army of several thousand volunteers who fight against the Zionists. For their part, the Jews organize an army by giving military training to its population and sending agents to Europe to retrieve World War II military stocks and sign arms contracts. On May 14, 1948, Britain completes its withdrawal from Palestine while the Jews proclaim independence of the State of Israel. In response, the Arab League declares war. During the conflict, 2 truces would allow the Israeli army to strengthen its position and gradually take over. Finally, the armistice agreements were signed. Israel seized new territory, including Western Jerusalem. Egypt received the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank was annexed from Transjordan to form Jordan. This conflict causes large-scale displacement. On the one hand, more than 700,000 Arabs were expelled or fled Israeli territory to refugee camps. On the other, Jewish communities in Arab countries, sometimes with a history of over 2,000 years, are forced to take refuge in Israel or elsewhere in Europe. Eventually, many European Jews were reassured by the victory of Israel and chose to settle there. In 1967, following tensions with its neighbors, Israel declares war on Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In 6 days, Israel dominates the war and triples its territory by seizing the Egyptian Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Israeli settlers begin to move into Palestinian territories. The UN reacts and adopts Resolution 242 condemning the Israeli occupation. 6 years later, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack to try and recover land. Initially, the Israeli army is routed and fails to repel the attack. Under the influence of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Arab countries support the offensive, while the United States sends emergency supplies of 22,000 tons of weaponry to Israel. With this boost, the Israeli army further continues to push its borders. After a ceasefire, oil-exporting Arab countries decide to punish the US and Israel's allies by increasing the price of oil by 70% and decreasing production by 5%. This causes the first oil crisis of 1973. Israel, under international pressure, ceded Sinai back to Egypt and a part of the Golan to Syria, but retains control over the Palestinian territories where colonization accelerates, especially in East Jerusalem. In 1980, Israel proclaims Jerusalem as its indivisible capital, but this decision was condemned by the UN Security Council. In the West Bank, tension mounts over water supply as Israel has the upper hand on resources which are unevenly distributed between Israeli settlements and Palestinian areas. In 1987, the Palestinian population rebels and takes to the streets, mostly armed with stones. This was the beginning of the First Intifada, an Arab term meaning uprising. In this context arises Hamas, a Palestinian Islamist movement fighting Israel. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, set up in 1964 by the Arab League and in exile in Algiers, proclaims an independent state of Palestine on November 15, 1988. Jerusalem would be its capital, and Palestine would progressively be recognized by 136 states. After 6 years of conflict, a fragile peace is signed with the Oslo agreements, which provide for mutual recognition. It also lays the foundation of introducing autonomy in the Gaza Strip and the city of Jericho. In 1995, a West Bank partition plan was signed, providing for Palestine-controlled areas, mixed areas, and the rest under Israeli control. But the two parties are unable to agree on thorny issues such as the status of Jerusalem and the return of Palestinian refugees. Negotiations fail and violence reignites. In Jerusalem, a visit by the head of the Israeli opposition to the holy site of the Temple Mount triggers the Second Intifada, marked by numerous suicide bombings. Israel begins construction of a wall in the West Bank to protect the country, but in doing so encroaches upon Palestinian territories. The wall is declared illegal by the International Court of Justice. To try to calm the situation, the Israeli government in 2005 decided to remove Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip, but retains control over its borders. In the years that follow, tensions focus around the Gaza Strip, mainly against Hamas, which came into power. Israel imposes a blockade in the region, while Hamas regularly fires rockets into Israeli territories. Several clashes take place, and violence by both sides builds up until 2014, when Israeli warplanes pound the area and destroy 50,000 houses, 100 schools, dozens of hospitals, and the region's only power plant. The population stuck in Gaza faced a humanitarian disaster. Today, the situation remains complicated, and lasting peace is nowhere on the horizon. On one hand, the West Bank is divided up between Palestinian towns and villages and more than 150 Israeli colonies. So striking a deal to carve out a Palestinian homeland seems more complicated than ever. Then there is the status of Jerusalem, which both sides view as their capital. In 2018, the United States announced it would move their embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the city as the capital of Israel. This decision was condemned by the UN by a large majority, while the Palestinians announced that the United States no longer has a mediator role in the peace process, which at present seems indefinitely stalled.
Those are the two videos I want to share. They're awesome.
Oh, I know. That was part of
I don't hear for that.
How we got so much